Hi everyone. Today we're just going to pick up from where we left off the previous time, where we did kind of a thought experiment, and I hope it actually benefited some of you out there, and that perhaps between then and now you have been trying to um, use this thought experiment to explore certain topics that perhaps in the past you kind of have certain out of bounds markers in your head, right? But hopefully you have gained some new insights into yourself, into why you see certain things the way you do, and perhaps even who or what has informed your perspectives on these aspects of life, right? Recently, for me, I think what has really informed my perspectives about how two different persons may be reading the same literature by the same author and then come to very different conclusions that are almost kind of like juxtaposed against each other, and how these opinions that they glean from this book may be a kind of like a result of a subconscious filtering that happens in our minds. And so many a times we may reach conclusions that are even not the intent of the author of the book, and may sometimes even be opposite or completely on the other end of where the author is trying to bring the reader. And I was just fascinated about why this is so, right? So I chatted with ChatGPT on a given night and just uh asking the ChatGPT questions, right? And I myself being a behaviorist um, theory enthusiast, um, I actually kind of sense that this is where it's going. But I think there's so many theories that eventually ChatGPT brought up for me that confirm my suspicions that in fact we are preconditioned before we even come to any sort of literature, right? So we bring our own framing of the world. And many a times in certain cultures like ours, in the Asian culture, we bring in a holism kind of view. Holism kind of view meaning that we try to harmonize all the given views that we have towards life so that there is kind of like in it makes a sense of coherence. It brings a sense of coherence to us. I mean, all kinds of frameworks, whether you are Asian, Western, they all try to kind of bring together and integrate different ways of thinking about life together so that our mind doesn't face some kind of mental dissonance or cognitive dissonance as it is. But all the more so for the Asian worldview because there are so many uh, hierarchies, social hierarchies, and kind of unspoken people to people interaction. And oftentimes, these kind of unspoken interactions or unspoken social cues, unspoken norms, and also kind of like power hierarchical structures in the family, or even between the society, the state, and the citizen, right? There's this sort of deep interdependence between all these parties, such that um, the Asian framework moves away from a very logical these cause these kind of way of understanding the world, because oftentimes if you try to harmonize so many people from the top down and then to in between the masses, if you try to harmonize all these views, the way to go about it then is not to take such a serious stance on, this cause this, but then for the Asian person in general, the world makes sense as it is, which means it is more about the lived experiences. It's more about um, what I embody in a certain given context and social context, right? And it's a persona that I assume that matters more than just a linear sort of logic, and that makes it perhaps a bit hard for them or for us when we actually read certain texts that we do not actually sometimes get the author's original intention, because we are trying our best to put this text within our own social context, and we are trying our best to see whether how this text can harmonize our relationship between us and our bosses, or relationship between us and our parents, or us and our state better, right? So usually we try to read in those cues that may not actually be in that text, right? We try to get from that text solutions to how we can harmonize our family relationship, how we can harmonize our friendship, because there's so much of what it means to be an Asian, right? But these may actually be very different from what the text is offering us in the first place. And that is why oftentimes Asians, when we read certain texts, even when it's supposed to stretch our minds about things like the authentic voice or the authentic self, or what it means to truly practice self-care beyond just going for I don't know how many massages or Bali holidays, right? There's something deeper about what it means to care for our own personal autonomy. And yet, oftentimes, this sense of pursuing our personal independence is at odds with the social cohesion we are trying to uphold, right? That from young, our parents have said to us that, mind your own business. Or perhaps the way that you actually succeed in life is to maintain a status quo in terms of your views, that your views should not be so distinct from the majority, right? So, and all those things are the subconscious or unconscious filters through which we even read certain literature that we are trying to get wisdom out of, right? As we progress through life. And therefore, as certain times these filters may actually work against us. And what we said in the previous week, that it doesn't bring us towards change. In fact, it brings us towards conformity. The more we read, we don't read to understand what's actually in the text. This subconscious filtering makes us read what is not there in the text. And therefore, oftentimes we hijack um, words and labels to try to infuse it with our own meaning. For example, the positivity, right? Positivity is a good thing. And I mean, as a general rule of thumb, I do feel that we should try to have hope in different situations, right? So that we do not feel stuck, right? We should pursue hope. And yet, how do we pursue hope? And yet, what is hope, right? Is hope just a plaster over negative situations in order to make things feel stable enough, right? So that could be more of a mental coping mechanism rather than a true handling of the situation, a true coping of the situation, or a true moving towards the situation to confront the real issues that are there. Right? So oftentimes we go back to this kind of inner coping mechanisms, which once again is fine and well because we all do this, no matter what culture you are in, no matter what time era you're in, generation you are in. We all do this to certain degrees and certain forms. But to be aware that this is happening, perhaps would help us to lean away from moving towards conformity alone, which isn't always bad because sometimes uh, to take directions from the crowd, as the proverb goes, right? When you are in Rome, live as the Romans do, because if you do not, you will be crucified in that sense. But oftentimes, but sometimes, once in a while, right, there come moments where we have to decide whether we would continue with what the crowd says um, at the expense of jeopardizing our own soul, as Jesus would say, right? To save your life is to lose it. Because if you want to actually save your own soul, your own autonomy, your own sense of independence and personhood and humanity, then you need to question what's beneath the thing, right? You need to question what's going on there, right? And oftentimes when we are in certain crisis, for example, this week I just told someone, a reportee of mine, right? We're having an exchange, a dialogue, and I was just saying that for me, I find it so increasingly needful for me to pause and to deal with the shock that I take in emotionally from day to day or from moment to moment, because we all have things that shock us, right? Whether it's the diagnosis, health diagnosis, or whether is it someone else's health diagnosis, or whether no, on one level, events do shake us, right? So wars and what the news speak us, and on another level, even micro events that happen, right? Or people's even micro interactions we have with others, their body language, the way that the vibe that they give off shocks us because sometimes we expect to find an inviting atmosphere, but instead we get coldness and hostility, right? So this can be from from people in the public, or it can be from loved ones as well. So all these things shocks us. And sometimes what shocks us is also when we expect systems to work the way it should work, but instead, people who perhaps should not be in power are in power, right? Or people who may not should not be in certain roles because they do not actually execute those roles um, competently and therefore cause suffering, not only to themselves, but to the whole the organization, the systems, the people, and society at large, because the whole is definitely affected by its parts, right? So when that happens, it shocks us as well. So all these shocks get bottled up, and if I don't pause to ask myself, am I moving towards conformity to try to handle these shocks? Um, I mean, subconsciously, I do think that there are certain mechanisms in me that I've learned or through evolution, the way I am wired, right? What has been passed down to me biologically, um, to act in certain ways to try to survive the shock that comes to me, right? So that I won't go into some kind of fits and be paralyzed mentally, emotionally. But if we continue down that track, then we may lose opportunities where we can actually, instead of conforming, to change. To change, not someone asked me this week, right? So does it mean that when you change in a relationship, because I told this person that in the context of relationship, all relationships changes the people involved, right? If you're involved in a relationship, by very definition of being involved, you will change. You are changing, right? There is no way that you can be who you are when you are relating to someone else. You can't remain 100% fully the way you have been. You will grow and you will evolve. That's just a fact, right? So whether you evolve towards better or worse, that's another question, right? Or whether it's a healthy path or not, right? Dysfunctional or not. But the point is, you will evolve. Then so the person asked me, so what about your authentic self? Does that mean your authentic self dies? But as you know, even from the Buddhist tradition, that the self itself, if you think it's a fixed thing, that's an illusion. The self moves through different stages. The self evolves, and there is a shedding of an old self, right? Every time we move through certain things in life, or even from day to day, and therefore, relationships. When it says we change through relationships, it doesn't mean that our true self gets denied or resisted or suppressed or repressed. In fact, relationships, the good ones, may actually bring out our deeper self, right? Because we are finally able to come out of the dark and out of hiding. So some relationships cause us to hide, and certain societies, cultures, environments causes us to hide. And especially in the Asian society where faith is image is dominant, right? There's so much of ourselves that we try to hide. I think the Japanese talks about the multiple persona, the multiple layers of face that we wear, right? So sometimes we're so used to that that we ourselves do not know who we are. Who are we, right? Which parts of us have we dreaded? Which parts of us have we um longed to be more of, right? Do we know? And which parts of us have we tried to keep um under the covers or in the closet, right? But there's always a becoming. We are becoming more of um what's happening inside of us, right? Whether for better or for worse. So usually we don't deal with some things that are boiling inside of us, then sooner or later it comes out in even darker forms and manners. So when we change, we don't mean that we are changing ourselves to, for example, you like chicken rice and then now you change to like laksa. It's not that kind of change, right? It's not just lifestyle or habits or superficial choices, but it is talking about deep change. And oftentimes we need deep change in order to even pursue what is a better and deeper and truer version of ourselves. We don't even know what that version is unless we are in community, right? Unless we are in a healthy relationship with someone, perhaps. So today, I'm just going to go a bit deeper to show us that how underneath the skin, we are very much fundamentally the same as the person who's sitting in front of us, maybe you're in the subway and you are listening to this, and the person in front of you is someone that you know you can't even get a grip on maybe what's going on in that person's life because he or she looks so different from you, right? Maybe he's not going to work, maybe he or she is going to school, or he or she is migrant worker, or he or she seems to be um you know dressed in a way that you find that to you is unruly, or to you is just you can't imagine someone would go out into public with that kind of a persona, with that kind of a faith. But yet, underneath our skin, we are very much the same. So let me share the screen. Yep. So oftentimes we label, right? So when you look at the person in front of you, you label. When you look at a certain concept, even when you read a certain literature, you label. You label whether this is east or west. And you have labels, and underneath the labels um, contain certain ideas, whether or not this label, generally speaking, or even objectively speaking, actually means something. For example, the idea of special needs or autism gets thrown out around a lot, right? But whether people are using it uh, in an objective sense, right, or true sense, that's another question. But the fact is that we label our world, and that's the way that we try to, in some sense, remain safe. Because the world feels uncertain, and sometimes when we don't label, we feel like our walls of defense have a hole, right? We feel like anytime a certain new idea can threaten our existing way of looking at life. For example, maybe for you, contentment is a big thing, right? Because there's this sense that if I'm not contented, then I will be very unhappy, right? But underneath this thing, it's not just about contentment, right? It's more than that. It's about satisfaction. It's about this desire actually to want a life of meaning. But perhaps you look around and you tried some steps and life still seems quite close up to you, that the opportunities don't come, right? Or perhaps you feel that you are living in a society or in a world where the road is kind of blocked or still towards the kind of satisfaction that you want. And therefore, you have learned to use contentment as a label, as a way to say that, if I move towards contentment, if I don't hope so much, if I don't desire so much, then probably I won't be so unsatisfied or unhappy. So this label kind of prevents you from getting disappointed in that sense, right? But oftentimes, if we want to actually explore um, why we put up these labels, then the labels itself must die. There must be kind of social, kind of a death to the familiar labels that which we use to define our lives, right? Before we can actually explore even the motivations that have been there the whole time. For example, the deep sense of frustration, or the deep sense of I'm not um, I can't find my way ahead in terms of getting meaning in work, or in relationships, right? So these are some of the frustrations that are actually deep down. And these causes us to perhaps say that, nowadays, for example, each gender will kind of have their own stereotypical view of the other gender. Because, for example, because perhaps they are speaking out of this deep frustration that I can't find alignment with all my exes, with all my ex-partners, right? So I use this label to prevent myself from feeling that deep satisfaction. So in some sense, the label has to die. But that is uncomfortable, right? As we have kind of experimented last week, and we have tried that thought experiment and shown that in some sense we got to make choices every day out of conditioning, because we can't stop. We will die out as a species if we have stopped at every juncture to consciously make choices and to constantly feel tension. We will be paralyzed, right? Tension between what we expect and what we see. So we have to constantly try to label, to readapt to reality. So labeling itself is not wrong. It's a human function. It's a needful function, but um, it can cause us not to be able to become creators, right? So we actually get stuck because we have this labeling system about so many things, about people, about events, about society. For example, if you say, for example, the Asian concept of a stable society is a label itself, right? So whenever someone tries to push against that and question what kind of stability, or um, does it are you sure you always feel safe? The person will rush back and say, yeah, of course I do. So stop threatening me. So if you threaten my label, if you're saying that this society may not be as stable as I think, um, you are going to be the one that makes society unstable. Do you see how ironic it is? Which means that whomever is trying to challenge your labels you will immediately argue that that person is trying, it will be the one that ultimately makes your society or your life or your world unsafe. But all the person is trying to do, all someone is trying to do when they are giving you an alternative point of view is an alternative point of view, right? They are not doing any action that actually makes society unsafe. But for the Asian, because social stability and safety is such a priority, even threatening, even challenging that idea of, social stability and safety feels like you are actually making society unsafe. But that's two different things. The person is not a terrorist, it's not a bomber, right? Or it's not someone that is trying to instigate racial tension. But because of our labels, we may get caught up with certain narrow views about how success, family, or even, for example, the necessity of friendship, right? So, for example, if your idea of friendship, your label of friendship is friends will never be truly be there for you because as life changes, only family will or marriage will, right? If that's your idea, you will perhaps neglect the prioritization of friends in your life because you feel that perhaps they should take a back seat because of their um function. Or but if you realize this is a perceived function because um friendships happen in many different forms and there are many kinds. So once again, the label of a friend is this. A friend can only do this. Kind of is a label. So it prevents and it confines your understanding of what could be real. And therefore you can't create those friendships that perhaps you would like to, right? So there's a kind of relationship between creativity and labeling because underneath it is this sense that death is approaching. So this is where I'm trying to land at, right? So all of us are in some sense um, both trying to create, but at the same time trying to stay within safe labels. So why do we stay within safe labels? You said because the future is uncertain, and if you talk about the ultimate uncertainties, it is what is death, right? What does death feel like? Where do I go after death? Or what does my life mean now that I know that it will eventually disappear from this world? So death is the ultimate change factor, right? So that's why we are kind of adverse towards all the small changes because it reminds us how our sense of self is not as stable as we would hope it is because it is going through a process of um, dying in that sense, right? So as you die to one label and pick up another label, which perhaps a healthier label, you are also in some sense realizing that this change itself is a mirror of what will happen to you um, in the near or hopefully distant future, right? Where death will overtake you once and for all. So whether it's the loss of a job, a relationship, a type of lifestyle, or phase in life, or even the death of a label, ultimately death brings horror, right? So that is why we try to find categories to manage our life so that in some sense we can keep this fear of death also kind of like you know hidden and tucked away. And even the Bible calls death the final enemy, right? So it's interesting because we all have our enemies, and I think the Bible means more than just our small problems. The Bible is talking about when it says death is the final enemy, it speaks of that in the context of the powers that be, human and demonic, that tries to bring evil into the world. But the ultimate source of all um, fear and insecurity and striving is because we all fear the ultimate thing that will take all this away, which is death, right? Now let's look at so I mean Job confronted death, and obviously Job's friends were wrong because they were trying to give him. So Job is a character in the Bible that went through a lot of unjust suffering. In one day, all his children died. All his children died. His business folded up because bandits came and ravaged his flock, his animals. And a whirlwind came and kind of destroyed his home. So all this thing happened, and he was ultimately struck with a severe bout of sores, right, all over his body. So he was crying out. The whole book of Job is this idea of lament, where Job is lamenting to God that or even in indignant lament where, I've done all the right things. What's happening to me now, right? Shouldn't goodness follows the righteous and evil follow the unrighteous, right? Why does this seem to be overturned in this world that we live in, right? So it's this very philosophical, in some sense, book that we are all, in some sense, like Job. We are all living in this kind of distortion of goodness, where it always seems like, there is injustice pressing in more than that is disproportionate to the good that we are trying to put out, right? In some sense, and whenever we try to put out good, there's always a resistance to it. Um, it comes from external forces that, you know, as much as we don't want to admit it, because in recent times there's a lot of talk of personal agency, right? For instance, like, personal agency in terms of your MBTI, where you know how to, where if you know your personality, you know what kind of job you want, what kind of partner you are compatible with, that kind of thing. And also, there's a lot of talk about how you can, perhaps even ground yourself and recenter yourself in times of trouble, and therefore you find the energy to move on. You're not stuck in your situations. You don't view yourself as a victim. Yeah, and there's a whole prosperity theology as well in the Christian kingdom or subculture, where it's about victory, speaking forth your victory, and all those things. And yet the book of Job shows that there's no easy answer to wrap up this whole thing, right? Because underneath it all, there's this nagging sense, which is true, this gnawing sense, that death is outside of your control, right? Life is outside of your control. As much as life comes to us as a gift, we do not know how long it is for, right? So James says that we are here today, gone tomorrow. Um, our lives are like, you know, it's like a drop in the bucket, right? It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. So this is what I feel actually links all of the human race together, which means despite all our different labels that we try to put to try to secure ourselves, the reason underneath the reason why we try to secure ourselves, because um, we feel that we are dying, we feel that we are losing parts of ourselves as we go through life, and we hope to find categories to stabilize ourselves. But let us look at a certain passage of ancient wisdom. So once again, I'm from the Jesus tradition. So let me read to you a passage from there, and we shall close. So this is actually the end of the book of Proverbs, right? So if you know, the book of Proverbs is a book of wisdom, right? And the famous book in Proverbs chapter 3 actually tells us that we should have some kind of reverence for the divine, right? For whoever placed us here, right? For the one that has given us life, and in some sense, the miracle, the grace of breath, right? So how should we properly respond to all this wisdom, right? And this is what it says in Proverbs 30. The man declares, I am weary, O God. I'm weary, O God, and worn out. Surely I am too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding of a man. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy One. So the person comes to the end of his life, and he's a bit like Job, actually, because he's saying that, I'm just frustrated. Like, you would think that at the end of the book of wisdom, you probably have some writings about how we have already figured this thing out, right? I mean, you've gone through 29 proverbs, right? And some preachers even say one proverb for a day, like as if the proverb will make you kind of like healthy, happy, and wise, right? But at this point, the one who's writing this, the words of Agur, son of Jaki, or Jake, he's basically saying that I'm weary, O God. I'm worn out. Surely I'm too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding of a man. He feels like he has failed, right? There's a sense of failure here and regret that, perhaps there were sources of wisdom that I had to listen to, but I did not listen to it. I did not heed it, right? I was too stupid for that. And perhaps there is, because understanding the Bible is always tied towards this idea of something that's an attitudinal thing. It's an attitude, it's a disposition rather than just facts to learn. That's the Hebraic understanding of wisdom. It's a posture, right? So there's this sense that I have not learned wisdom. I've not learned this posture at all. In fact, but now I am not only have I not learned this posture, I'm tired. I don't understand how can someone come to this kind of um, posture of how to navigate life's complexities, all the ironic realities and contradictions as we spoke about just now, where you can even read something and not read it right because of your prior social conditioning. So I guess all of that in the ancient world they did not have an understanding of those kind of behavioral, you can call it evolutionary psychology, but yet I'm sure, and we should not ever say that they do not know what it means to be human, right? They obviously are. In every time and space, human beings have been trying to figure out what this thing's all about. And they're feeling like at the end of the day, it's a lot of fatigue, right? Like what Apostle Paul says, right? With more knowledge comes more sorrow. There's this idea that um no, I'm frustrated and I don't seem to have learned. I don't seem to have come to any kind of a fruitful revelation or a fulfillment of wisdom. I do not seem to have become what I want to be, right? It's like what most of us feel, right? I've not become what I want to be. I have not learned wisdom. And then it says this, right? Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his son's name? Surely you know. So, I mean, some Christians will rush and say, this is talking about Jesus, right? What is his son's name? So he's Jesus, right? But in this case, I mean, reading it in the context, sure, you can interpret that in light of Jesus and his where he is in the Hebraic drama of redemption and how God comes to save the world. But in this case, the response is surely you know, which means this author doesn't know. He doesn't know. He's like, who has ascended to heaven? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? I mean, in some sense, only God, right? Only the divine, and this is the same refrain that God uses when God appeared to Job, right? So in the end of the book of Job, God appears to him and say that, who has done all these mighty works of creation except me? So in some sense, it's put into Job this holy fear that would that is there not to crush him, but actually in my reading, to revive Job, because the idea is that Job in his suffering, is also now suffering from the sense of the loss of control, right? But God is trying to tell him that the loss of your control has always been the reality, right? So the false illusory thing, like what Buddhism in some sense hints, is we think that ourself is a very stable, constructed thing that we can sort of protect from the vicissitudes of life out there, right? Out there, and the self is in here and the world is out there. But yet, all of it is actually connected, right? What is out there, the wind, the waters, the ends of the earth, and who we are is interconnected. I mean, we now know this, right? Climate change and all the other things, right? We are interconnected with the whole. So in some sense, God is saying to Job at the end of the book of Job, and also what this um, person here is crying out in the midst of his frustration is, I know somehow that I'm connected to the grand whole, right? But how I'm connected, I'm not sure, but there is some connection. And I'm not the one, okay, and this connection shows me that I cannot be the one to resolve the world's pain and my own pain, which means I am not the one responsible, totally responsible for my own pain, because I'm also not the one responsible for the world's pain, right? Because there is a connection between my pain and the world's pain. So this flies in the face of modern um, Instagrammable quotes, right? That gives us back, as I said just now, our kind of personal agency where we think we can do uh, so much and all that. And yet, a lot of times that itself is a label because we want to label our independence as, with such extensive power because it makes us feel less powerless. And we feel like the universe is like spitting us out and we feel like, things should not be so unfair and I can actually prevent it from being so unfair. But the Bible is about reality, and reality is that the world is cruel, the world is unfair. And oftentimes it just continues to be so no matter what you do. Ecclesiastes says that there is nothing new under the sun, everything that has been will be, and everything that will be has always been, right? There's nothing new. So in this sense also, the ends of the earth and all this thing that's going on has always been, and it's always been in some sense, in some sense in a it has always been in chaos, right? So that's why in the book of Genesis, when God tried to put order, which is one of our podcast content a few podcasts ago, and I encourage you to listen to all the podcasts in chronology because it actually talks about all these various themes, and sometimes you have to listen to one to make sense of the other, right? Is that God is in the Hebrew mind, God is creator, it shows God as ordering a world that is chaotic. So it's not about creating a world out of nothing as the modern science would think about it, which is no, I have no problem with that. And I don't think the Bible is a problem with that. It's just talking about different things. Here, the Bible is more about a philosophical sense that God is actually ordering the cosmos, the universe that is very chaotic with many different stakeholders, economic stakeholders, principalities, powers, forces, demonic and human, that messes this whole thing up. And God is about kind of like restoring the order to this chaotic universe, right? So the writer of the book of Job and the writer here is both trying to say that, perhaps we should not take so much responsibility in the ultimate sense. Of course, do what you need to do to make your life better, right? That's the whole point of learning this thing about experimentation of the mind to explore. But okay, to explore, to kind of grow, right, and evolve and not move towards conformity with what you have kind of like subconsciously already believe because of your culture. By the same time, perhaps the one of the key motivation that can help you to change is also to know that in some sense you cannot fully change, right? Which means the motivation to actually help you to grow is to know that in some sense, you cannot entirely be free from the world around you. It's just a fact. The world and the universe around you is something you are caught up in. And that's why in suffering, the psalmist and the prophets cry out for God's intervention, because in some sense, this is not no longer our domain. I realize the pain of my life actually points to the pain in society, in the environment, in the world as a whole. And therefore, if that is not within my control, sometimes the pain in my life ultimately is also not within my control, if it makes sense, right? Which means I may never find the cause of the pain in my life because ultimately I also cannot find the cause of the pain in the universe out there, or in society out there, in the world out there. It's it's overly complex, and therefore I must give myself space and self-compassion, even about the pain that I am processing personally. So there is this interconnection that the writers of the biblical tradition tries to make. It's like, who is offended? If not for you, right? Because you're the one that ordered creation. So, I mean, the Bible's cry is come and order it again. Only you can order it, right? Because you spoke light into darkness, you created order of chaos, then come and do it again. Because in some sense, my life is tied up with that. And therefore, it says, every word of God proves true. He's a shield to those who take refuge in Him. So there's this idea that I can't find refuge in this illusory self anymore. I need to take refuge in something bigger than myself, right? So why is this bigger than ourselves? Because we want to be bigger than death. In some sense, we are hoping that there are safe arms that will receive us when we realize that we cannot no longer shelter ourselves, right? And it doesn't mean we don't shelter ourselves in a responsible adult sense, right? I mean, ultimately, we cannot shelter ourselves. So if I am trying to pursue righteousness and goodness for the sake of others, I may be persecuted and I may be crushed in board meetings. I may be crushed with my reporting officer. I may be crushed in multiple ways by society or even jail, right? I may have all those things. And that's why ChatGPT was telling me that to be a Christian in Asia, which I have always suspected, it's kind of like a social death because Asians, many times we go back to this like glory to the family, bring fame to the family and all that, right? So there's this idea of competition, getting to the top, right? And this idea of like getting honor and not shame. And suddenly when Jesus picks up the towel, um, we are shocked. We are like, this is an inversion. When Jesus tells us that the enemy is also your friend, the enemy can be your friend. You can see your own face in the face of your neighbor, which brings us to into perspective taking and all that, which is something that's contrary to self kind of like, self-boasting and all that. It's a kind of social death because what will our family think, right? How do we contradict our family when we learn that to be strong is to actually expose our weaknesses, right? How can we actually um, bring that to our family, right? Who will then think that we have gone crazy and whose own reputation is now at stake because we have tried to live in a different way, right? So it's kind of a social death. But maybe those who pursue the social death end up finding that the universe is far bigger, far more loving than we would ever expect it to be, right? So every word of God proves true. He's a shield to those who take refuge in Him, right? Who takes refuge in Him. So there's this idea that um, the end of the book of wisdom, perhaps wisdom is not so much um, what you can ultimately achieve, right? But it is more of a resting and being in the arms of God, right? In that sense, in the arms of the divine, in the arms of this knowledge that your own pain is connected to the world's pain, and that's not ultimately your problem in a deeper sense. And do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. Right. So oftentimes, this rebuke in the books of wisdom, whether it's in Proverbs or in the wisdom tradition, Ecclesiastes, there's this idea of let your words be few because, and that doesn't mean you don't. That's not about talking about literally in situations just don't talk so much. This person is a yapper, that kind of thing. It's not just a personal preference thing. It's more of let your words be few about the ultimate, right? So for example, judge not, or you shall be judged, because you do not know a human being's deepest motivations of his heart, the deepest motivations, right? I mean, all humans want to be loved, to belong, and that is what, in some sense, the biblical tradition is also about, right? That we all humans have a fundamental need to belong, to be loved, and to be included, which is what Jesus came to do, in some sense, to open up a divine invitation for everyone in the social strata to come, okay, wherever SES you are in to come, right? So there's a sense that Jesus is also inverting the table constantly by telling the Pharisees, do not add to God's word, that do not judge where you're not your jurisdiction, because you do not know ultimately what the problem of the universe. Sometimes you not even know what the problem of the universe is, right? You can't see that clearly into it, and therefore you also can't see clearly into your own life and the life of people to that deeper sense. So don't let your words be few and sit, sit with these realities instead of um, just trying to um, label it. Yeah. So once again, it's a death of labeling. Yeah. So your words, your labeling, right? Because when God spoke His words were basically divine labels that organize the world. But let your labels, our labels as humans in a limited perspective, be few. And that's why in 11 to 14, you see that there's this sense of overconfidence and arrogance in these people who might perhaps perceive that their worldviews are absolute, right? There are those who curse their fathers, do not bless. So that's like your labeling, and because cursing and blessing are labels. So you try to define who's in, who's out. You try to, your eyes are lofty, you lift your eyelids in a sense that you think you have already kind of like seen through it all. Teeth are sought. So, again, words, labeling, that crush and devour the poor and the needy, where you give easy solutions, and oftentimes it's deceptive, right? It's more for the fact of the ego, where gurus, false teachers who promise, overpromise, right? And clean in your own eyes, but yet you are not washed of their filth because you don't confess that you do not know, right? And Jesus oftentimes says that if you don't confess that you can't see, you're the one that perhaps is the most blind, right? Yeah. And yeah, if you've been foolish exalting yourself, or if you've been devising evil, put your hand on your mouth, right? So there's a sense that devising evil, planning evil is in the same direction, the same tone as exalting yourself, right? So exalting yourself does not mean you don't affirm yourself for all the things that you should affirm yourself for what you have done to for the good of others. But exalting yourself as this idea of foolishness, which means it's the ultimate kind of exalting, right? Where you think you might have figured out just what life is about, right? Which means your framing of the world makes you, as we said in the early, I mean, as we started the whole thing, right? Confined within that framing, where you can't see beyond that framing, perhaps into into the stories of others, to make space for the story of others, to include the story of others, or to not see the story of others as inferior to yours, and the emotions they feel, the perspectives they bring, but you would cling to yours in an absolutist way, right? And oftentimes this goes subconsciously, as we've spoken, subconscious filters, right? And yet the Bible says that in some sense this is foolishness when we continue to allow those unconscious filters, right? And I think most of the subconscious filters cause us to be foolish, right? It causes us to exalt ourselves, right? So there's a sense of blindness that leads to this kind of moral um, blindness, psychological blindness. It's part of the moral blindness in that sense. Yeah, so this is the human condition, and I think the biblical tradition is rich in the realism of what human life is about. I watched a theater play called The Christian, and they're trying to show us that even within the Christian tribe, that we are deeply fragmented because oftentimes we don't see beyond our own fences, right? So once again, we exalt ourselves. There's a sense that this is an absolute way of seeing things, right? Whether you are progressive or liberal, progressive or conservative, you are not seeing beyond the fence. But the whole Bible, in one sense, is going over the fence, because the divine goes over the fence to continually speak to his creation. So that in itself is already going over the fence, um, where the creator kind of goes over the fence to connect with the creator. That is, in some sense, the beauty of the biblical tradition. I'll leave you with this thought that Abraham looked at the stars, and the ex-partner looked at the flag. Yeah, so I was watching this movie where um it's like kind of a romance slash kind of rebuilding your life kind of show, Cantonese show. And there was this part where the couple, because one of them is in heavy debt, and she has to pay her debt by trying to rebuild the business of a bar that she owned, right? And not the bar would go to another person's hands, and she would be in debt and all that. And her partner, ex-partner, someone that I mean, they started out together well, but they seem to be able to support each other only for certain kind of crisis moments. And when he stepped in, they would like argue and go their separate ways. But there was this scene where um, they will reconcile once again. They were trying to fight for this bar, uh, for the upkeeping of this bar. And both of them at night, they were very desperate, hopeless. They were looking out into the flats, right? Into the Hong Kong flats. And the ex-partner was like, if you look at those flats, the people living in those flats, the millions of them, I'm not sure millions, is it? The millions in Hong Kong or hundreds of thousands, right? They are struggling to make ends meet because the context is, of course, Hong Kong's housing prices, it's all-time high, it's skyrocketed, right? So how much more? I mean, if they have the confidence to live another day, how much more us, right? So he said that, and so notice what he didn't say. He didn't say it's not fearful. He didn't say the situation was not bad, but he was saying that perhaps there's a way to still hold out possibility just below the surface of death. I mean, to acknowledge that death is real and we may lose, we may die, right? We may die all these small deaths along the way as well. But there is something deeply human that which is what the biblical tradition believe would live on, which is the soul, right? That will live on beyond death. And maybe the biblical tradition is making us think a bit deeper that maybe the way to overcome death is not so much to just theorize what happens when we die and how can we make sure that we don't die and go to a literal place called hell, right? Maybe that is not so much the direction. Maybe the biblical tradition is trying to call on us to also think deeply. How are we living now in a way that defies death, right? How are we living now and taking ownership of this thing called the soul, our autonomy, our voice, our sense of the individual self, right? That oftentimes is born into conditioning, but is scratchy, is calling us to something more than what we have experienced so far, right? And calling us to risk. What if that self, right here and now, has the possibility of transcending death right here and now? Because it's not about when we die, but it's about here and now. We manage this fear of death by looking it face on and believing that um, if we can reclaim today by doing those thought experiments, by exploring different pathways of thinking about something, by listening to the stranger and to someone else with a different alternative, maybe those are ways that we overcome the fear of death, even here, even now. Blessings.